Okay, I think that's on. Good evening, everyone. My name is Carla Durand, and on behalf of the two co-sponsoring organizations for this evening's lecture, the Collegeville Institute and the J. Phillips Center for Interfaith Learning, I am pleased to welcome you to this evening's lecture titled Hindu Monks and Missionaries in Late Modernity, Reflections of a Christian Comparative Theologian. In December 2014, an Indian parliamentary minister raised a storm of controversy when he proposed a ban on all religious conversions throughout India. This event represented merely the most recent moment in an ongoing conversion controversy which has hung over Hindu-Christian relations for over 2 centuries. Tonight, our speaker, Dr. Reid Locklin, will get behind this controversy by exploring the theologies of several Hindu missionaries in the modern era, monastic visionaries who gave new expression to the non-dualist Hindu tradition of Vedanta and reinvented it as a global religious movement. Such Hindu missionaries, in turn, offer Christians an opportunity to rethink their own theologies of mission and conversion. A few words about Dr. Reid Locklin. Reid is Associate Professor of Christianity and the Intellectual Tradition at the University of Toronto, a joint appointment with St. Michael's College and the Department for the Study of Religion. His research focuses on a range of issues in comparative theology in Hindu-Christian studies, particularly the engagement between Christian thought and the Hindu tradition of Advaita Vedanta. His works include Spiritual but Not Religious, Liturgy of Liberation, and the edited volume Vernacular Christianity, Vernacular Saints, Selva J. Raj on Being Catholic, the Tamil Way. Reid and his wife Jolie, who's with us this evening in the back, are with us and here on campus through the end of, or actually till the middle of this month. And just one side note, some of you may have recently heard Jolie playing oboe at the monastic Triduum and other liturgical services. So thank you, Jolie, for sharing your talents with our campus community. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Reid Locklin.
Thanks, Carla. Thank you very much, Carla, and I want to thank the Collegeville Institute, especially Viv, Elisa, Carla, and Don, as well as the St. John's Abbey community for your very warm hospitality. It's been such a wonderful privilege to be here. I want to thank John Merkel and the J. Phillips Center for Interfaith Learning for sponsoring this lecture. And finally, I want to acknowledge the state of Minnesota as the traditional territory of the Dakota, the Anishinaabe, and other indigenous peoples, and to offer my gratitude for the opportunity to live and to work on this land and this territory. So as Carla mentioned in introducing me, there was this event in 2014, right at the end of the year, in which a parliamentary affairs minister called for an end to all religious conversions of any kind in India. And I suggested in that introduction, and I'll suggest to you again now, that this is just one recent episode, one recent moment in this ongoing conversion controversy. To some extent, a controversy around conversions to non-Indian religions, and in particular to Christianity, has shaped the Hindu-Christian encounter since the arrival of Vasco da Gama and Western colonial powers to the shores of India in 1498, and that's depicted here on the left. At the same time, the controversy has acquired a distinctive shape in the 20th and 21st centuries. In the wake of Indian independence, for example, several states have enacted anti-conversion legislation. Beginning in 1967 and continuing right up until last year, there was a new set of legislation. In 1998, the BJP Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee called for a national debate on conversions in light of Christian missionary work in tribal communities of India, and this call was punctuated by the brutal murder of the Australian missionary Graham Staines and his 2 young sons the following year. The flames of controversy have been fanned more recently by, among other factors, the 2008 anti-Christian riots in Kandhamal that you may have heard of, and of course the return of Hindu nationalists to power with the election of Narendra Modi as Prime Minister of India in May 2014. and that's Prime Minister Modi on the right. In the project that I've been working on for the past few years, and just as a sidebar, I'm totally going to lose track of this at several points in the lecture, so we can all be comfortable with that. I've been attempting to reframe the controversy by shifting our attention just a bit. Specifically, I am suggesting that we lift our view from the South Asian context and the history of this particular debate about conversions to a comparative study of the categories of conversion, and in particular the category of mission themselves by means of a kind of specific test case. The test case that I've chosen is that of the non-dualist tradition Advaita Vedanta, and to look at that tradition as a distinct missionary movement manifested in several different social and institutional forms. The purpose of the project, which I've tentatively entitled Hindu Mission, Christian Mission, very creative, is both descriptive and constructive. Descriptively, I argue for the coherence of such diverse modern movements as the Ramakrishna Mission. I'm so glad Chris is here, who knows a lot more about that particular movement than I do. Ramana Ashramam, the Chinmaya Mission, Transcendental Meditation, and the Sringeri Vidya Bharati Foundation as expressions of an indigenous Advaita missionary impulse with roots at least as far back as the 8th century CE. Constructively, I aim to draw out the distinctive character of the missions theologies that emerge from these movements as a resource for rethinking and rearticulating contemporary Christian theologies of mission and of conversion. Now, it may come as some relief to y'all that in today's lecture I don't intend to walk through my full project. I did that with my colleagues at the Institute yesterday, and it's remarkable that they're all still standing. Instead, I'd like to introduce you to the idea of comparative missiology by offering short profiles of two of the lesser-known movements included in my study. In the first part of the lecture, I will introduce the silent mission of a silent sage, Ramana Maharshi. From there, in the second part, I will turn to the more explicitly missionary and nationalistic theologies of Swami Chinmayananda and the worldwide Chinmaya mission. And finally, briefly, I'll offer a few initial reflections on what kind of questions I think that these two movements, at least, raise for the Christian comparativist. Following this initial presentation of my project, I look forward to your questions, insights, and conversation. So let's begin with Ramana Maharshi. In 1930, the British journalist Paul Brunton set out in search of what he would later describe as a, quote, India which has been hidden from prying eyes for thousands of years, namely the mystic India of ancient yogis and rishis. In the 1934 book, A Search in Secret India, he related a journey full of many purported holy men, some judged fraudulent, others judged genuine. But the high point came when he stayed at a small ashram on the southern face of the hill Arunachala in the Indian state of Tamil Nadu. After a short initial visit, Brunton continued his travels, only to return, prompted by a series of coincidences and what he described as an irresistible inner voice. This time he received more instruction, engaged in rigorous self-inquiry, and arrived at what he called spiritual certitude about humankind's ultimate identity with God and the eternal refuge deep within each and every human person. He offered the following summary of his insights. Quote, I can only say that in India I found my faith restored. This faith was restored in the only way a skeptic would have it restored, not by argument, but by the witness of an overwhelming experience. And it was a jungle sage, an unassuming hermit who had formerly lived for 20 years in a mountain cave, who prompted this vital change in my thinking, end quote. This jungle sage, who restored Brunton's faith and provoked this overwhelming experience, was the widely venerated Ramana Maharshi. Now, Brunton was not the first European to meet the Maharshi, nor the first to communicate his teachings to a Western audience. Nevertheless, the account in A Search for Secret India led to a dramatic increase in visitors to the ashram, as well as providing an accessible summary of Ramana's teaching. In this case, the content of the message is inextricable from the person of Ramana himself. Born Venkataraman Iyer in a small village near Madurai, Tamil Nadu, Ramana had a relatively unremarkable childhood. At the age of 17, however, he experienced what Arvind Sharma has called his conversion experience, the pivot on which the rest of his life was destined to turn. Seized by a sudden fear of death, Ramana spontaneously lay down on the ground and began imitating a corpse. He stiffened. He held his breath. He imagined himself burning up in the funeral pyre. Then he began a rigorous process of internal self-examination. And this is a paraphrase of what he was thinking. Quote, "With the death of this body, am I dead? Is the body I? This body is silent and inert. But I felt the full force of my personality and even the sound I within myself, apart from the body. The only real thing in that state and all the conscious activity that was connected with my body was centered on that. The I, or myself, was holding the focus of attention by a powerful fascination from that time forwards. Fear of death had vanished at once and forever." This was in 1896, and the content of Ramana's realization was advaita, non-dualism, the ultimate non-difference of the innermost self of the conscious person and the divine reality. Within a year, Ramana had abandoned his family and home, journeyed to Arunachala, and taken up a life of silent contemplation, first in and around a local temple, and then in a cave on a hill. He slowly attracted disciples, and in 1922, he took up residence in an ashram they constructed for him, Ramanashramam. Ramana Maharshi's preferred mode of teaching was silence. He did offer written expositions in response to requests, and gradually, as he underwent a slow process of return to outer activity, after his initial absorption, began to grant personal interviews, like the interview he granted to Paul Brunton. In a work considered among his most comprehensive and authoritative, entitled Reality in 40 Verses, one verse aptly captures the gist of his teaching. Quote, "When the mind turns inward seeking, 'Who am I?' and merges in the heart, then the I hangs down its head in shame, and the one I appears as itself. Though it appears as I, it is not the ego. It is reality, perfection, the substance of the self." End quote. Ramana called this method simply vichara, or self-inquiry, and it functioned as the central discipline of self-knowledge in his tradition. Condensed very briefly, the method entails a relentless asking of the question, "Who am I?" Or stated differently, a continual pursuit of that which sees ever deeper into the inner self, from that which sees the world, to that which sees the body, to that which sees the mind, and so on. Such a process of negation leads ineluctably to the extinction of the individual ego, and with this extinction, the spontaneous self-revelation of the effulgent Atman, the I, or perhaps the I of the I, as the sole true existent. This divine I is symbolized by the spiritual heart on the right side of the chest, where people instinctively point when they say, "It is I." I haven't lost it yet. The precise relation of this teaching to classical Advaita Vedanta has been the subject of considerable discussion among both devotees and scholars. On the one hand, Ramana and his disciples insisted that his self-realization was not preceded by any study of Vedanta. It was spontaneous and experiential. On the other hand, Ramana never resisted the identification of his teaching with that of the great 8th century sage Adi Shankaracharya, who's usually seen as the preeminent teacher in the tradition. And he eventually produced original Tamil translations of Advaita classics he considered particularly conducive to the practice of self-inquiry, such as the popular Viveka Chudamani or Crest Jewel of Discrimination. However deep or shallow its roots in the classical tradition, Ramana Maharshi's teaching made a significant mark on the subsequent development of modern Advaita. Ramana did not himself found an explicitly missionary movement. On this score, as the scholar of new religions, Philip Charles Lucas, has observed, He stands in explicit contrast to Swami Chinmayananda, who we'll turn to next, as well as to many other modern Vedantins. Nevertheless, the so-called Ramana effect took on a life of its own by reason of its portability, its universality, and its deep affinity with aspects of a growing contemporary movement toward what Lucas calls liberal spirituality. Ramana's legacy has been preserved and disseminated through the original Ramanashramam and its board of trustees, through almost 50 affiliate centers and individual satsang groups throughout the world, and through a very active publishing division. A lay devotee named Bhagavat Prasad Singh founded Arunachala Ashrama in a suburb of New York City, that's there in the middle, in 1966, and an affiliate retreat center in rural Nova Scotia, that's over here, in 1972. More significant, I would argue, than any of these initiatives, however, has been the reception of Ramana's teaching into the work of other Advaita movements, such as the Divine Life Society and the Chinmaya Mission, as well as the teachings of such influential European and North American teachers as Eckhart Tolle, figured there, Gangaji, and Arunachala Ramana, who I think is Texan. This indirect, assimilative process of reception should not be taken as accidental, nor as a sign of the teaching's limited scope. Rather, it reveals the distinctive character of this particular missionary movement. When asked why he did not travel or preach like other teachers, Ramana reportedly replied, quote, "How do you know that I'm not doing it? Preaching is simple communication of knowledge. It can be done in silence too," end quote. The editors of the short volume, Hunting the Eye, similarly insist that Sri Ramana Maharshi and his message have neither backing nor propaganda. They have found their silent way all over the world to those hearts that were ripe and ready for them. Ramana's Western disciple, Arthur Osborne, goes a bit further. In a passage that I think is particularly suitable to the octave of Easter in which we are, he writes the following, and quote, "The story of Ramana Maharshi is no more ended than the story of Christ was ended upon the cross. It is indeed not a new religion that Sri Bhagavan brought upon the earth, but a new hope, a new path, for those who understand and aspire from every land and every religion in this age of spiritual darkness. It was not for his body's lifetime only. To those who feared that the guidance might end with death, he, Ramana, replied curtly, 'You attach too much importance to the body.' Now, as then, he guides whoever approaches him, and whoever submits to him he supports. To all who seek, he is here," end quote. The mission of Ramana Maharshi may challenge many prevailing assumptions about missionary activity, not least a presumption that mission always follows from self-conscious intention or agency. Instead, this mission works anonymously in a way uniquely suited to a silent sage. And now, as a show that perhaps some of the younger members of the audience will have forgotten, now for something completely different. Swami Chinmayananda. On December 23rd, 1951, in the early years of Indian independence, Swami Chinmayananda Saraswati, figured here, arrived in the city of Pune by train, fresh from his studies of Vedanta in the sacred Himalayas. That same evening, he delivered a lecture, provocatively entitled, "Let Us Be Hindus." After drawing attention to the apparent irony of his title, he was addressing an audience of Hindus in front of a Hindu temple. Chinmayananda indicted the decadent state of modern Hinduism, laying blame primarily on the deteriorating quality of the Brahmin and Kshatriya classes, the machinations of what he called, quote, "selfish, arrogant, power-mad priest caste," and the overgrowth of mythologies, commentaries, and other shastras that have obscured the true nature of Hinduism. His solution? What he called a Upanishad Jnana Yajna, or sacrifice of knowledge, dedicated to the Kena Upanishad, one of the Vedic scriptures. He concluded his introduction of this event. Quote, "During these 100 days of the Upanishad Jnana Yajna, we will be trying to discover the eternal happiness and bliss that is the succulent essence of all true religions. In a spirit of communal living for these 100 days, we shall come to discover the science of perfection, the true essence of Hinduism, end quote. Thus, Chinmayananda initiated his yajna plan to communicate the teachings of Vedanta to the educated middle classes throughout India and beyond. As he would sometimes summarize the matter, he had initiated a lifelong mission to convert Hindus to Hinduism. Okay. Now, in his public teaching, Swami Chinmayananda frequently invoked the legacy of Swami Vivekananda and the Ramakrishna mission. The mission was a movement that Vivekananda founded in the late 19th century. Sometimes Chinmayananda is called, within his movement, a second Vivekananda, but it's kind of like my family saying that we're descendants of Charles the Great. Like, I think everybody says that, right? So, I think a more legitimate influence on Chinmayananda's actual teaching is Ramana Maharishi. Chinmayananda, as a young man, had a couple encounters with Ramana on his way to becoming the person who would be Swami Chinmayananda. Chinmayananda, like Ramana Maharishi, sometimes characterizes Advaita teaching and the movement towards liberation as a process of destroying the ego or attaining a state of, quote, thought extinction. More typically, however, he offered various schematic analyses of the human condition as befits what he called a science of perfection. According to the 5 sheaths of food, vital air, mind, intellect, and bliss, for example, or the threefold experiences of the world of objects through the body, the world of feelings through the mind, and the world of ideas through the intellect. Beginning in 1955, he began using the so-called body-mind-intellect chart, or BMI chart. To illustrate this latter analysis, as well as to show the ultimate foundation of embodied life, of the body, mind, and the intellect, in the divine principle, that is, the self and true subject of all possible experiences, symbolized in the chart by the sacred syllable Om. Obscuring this divine principle, at the source of our individuality and our sensory experiences, stand the vasanas, the V. Subjective tendencies inherited from past experience in this and previous lives. Hence, the state of self-knowledge and liberation, sometimes characterized as thought extinction, is more correctly for Chinmayananda identified as the exhaustion or destruction of these vasanas, of these tendencies. Like many other modern Vedantins, Swami Chinmayananda accepted a number of alternate means by which the process of vasana exhaustion can proceed, depending on personal temperament and maturity. But he also refocused attention on the scriptural sources of the teaching, which he described as Mother Shruti, the direct experiences and revelation of the ancient rishis, the cold waters of the Ganges that startle us free from our dreamlike experiences of the world when they're splashed in our face. Such awakening, such splashing of the water into our face, is accomplished primarily by means of a fairly traditional threefold Advaita method: hearing, reflection, and contemplation. Thus, in addition to periodic fortnight or longer jnana yajnas offered by Swami Chinmayananda and other renunciant teachers on core Vedanta scriptures, the movement also developed a distinctive structure of small weekly discussion groups led by lay people and structured according to a progressive scheme of study, along with ample opportunities for devotional puja and instruction in meditation. Whereas puja, or devotion, and selfless action in the world purify the mind and prepare it to receive the teaching, it's only through hearing the scripture, through disciplined study, especially in these small study groups, and contemplative practice, that it can become quiet, hitched to one line of thought, and eventually, at least for brief moments, perfectly silent and actionless, in a state of absolute bliss. Viewed in comparison to Ramana Maharshi, Swami Chinmayananda's teaching can be interpreted as a return to more traditional methods and sources of Advaita Vedanta. It's fitting then that he also rationalized his innovations by appeal to a deeply traditional authority, the 8th century teacher Adi Shankaracharya, as portrayed especially in the legendary late medieval and early modern narratives of Shankara's Digvijaya, or religious conquest, of the Indian subcontinent. Indeed, Chinmayananda constructed his movement on the model of this famous Vedantin, whom he described as, quote, one of the most vigorous missionaries in our country, who rediscovered in the Upanishads the true cultural basis of our nation, and who led a dramatic revivalist movement better characterized as a revolution. And one of the famous books that comes out of the movement is this book, Shankara the Missionary. With Shankara the Missionary and cultural revolutionary as a model, it makes good sense that Chinmayananda's own mission was also characterized by teaching throughout India, and beginning with his first Digvijaya Yatra, or global conquest, in 1965, the world. It was also characterized by systematic institutionalization. The Chinmaya mission quickly gave birth to a number of institutions dedicated to fostering cultural and religious revival in India and the diaspora. In addition to numerous mission centers worldwide, these include the Bal Vihar and Chinmaya Yuva Kendra programs for children and young adults beginning in 1959, Sandipani Sadhanalaya, a kind of seminary system centralized in Mumbai in 1963, it was Bombay then, a network of state schools beginning in 1965, Chinmaya Mission West in California in 1975, a research center located at the traditional maternal home of Shankara in 1999, and they've actually just founded a university in India as well. Swami Chinmayananda placed special emphasis on the full inclusion of women in the Chinmaya mission. And from the early 1980s onward, the empowerment of marginalized Indian women became the primary focus of the Chinmaya Organization for Rural Development, which is depicted here in the middle. The institution associated with the mission that has attracted the most scholarly attention, however, is not among those that bear the name Chinmaya at all. It's the Hindu nationalist Vishva Hindu Parishad, or VHP, which Swami Chinmayananda co-founded in 1964. And this is a picture of a VHP rally. Now, there's no question that Chinmayananda can be safely classified as a kind of Hindu nationalist. Before taking up monastic life and the study of Vedanta, he had worked as a political activist and journalist in the independence movement in the 1930s and 1940s. And his interpretation of Shankara as a missionary in a war of culture for sacred India strikes an obvious and unmistakably nationalist chord. Nevertheless, some interpreters have also noted that Chinmayananda deliberately distanced himself from the VHP ideology after he founded the organization. And one of the authorized history of the movements, one of the authorized histories of the Chinmaya mission, it's authorized, it's come from within the mission itself, describes a self-conscious break between the Chinmaya mission and the VHP. When asked directly about the matter shortly before his death, he dies in 1993, and this was asked of him in 1992. He was teaching in Michigan, I think. He's asked, well, what about the VHP? And he offered a really interesting reply that bears directly on the nature of his missionary vision. Quote, when your Pope came to India, that is Paul VI in 1964, he said he was going to convert 125 people to Christianity. Public opinion made him withdraw his plan, but I was in Bombay, and I announced that I would convert 200 people to Hinduism, and I did. Then I had the idea to start a group to work for conversions. The VHP, the group he founded, has grown into a mighty force. It is all over the world. After I started the VHP, I returned to my own mission as a spiritual teacher of Vedanta. Anyone can do the work of the VHP. End quote. So on the one hand, Swami Chinmayananda seems to approve of conversion to Hinduism, presumably referring here to rites of purification or shuddhi, or homecoming, pararvartan, originally developed by the Arya Samaj in the late 19th century and adapted by the VHP to reconvert Indian Muslims and Christians and also to integrate low caste and tribal communities into the Hindu fold. All of those communities, Christians, Muslims, tribals, and low caste, just need to be purified to become fully Hindu. On the other hand, interestingly, this was not Swami Chinmayananda's own mission, nor the most valuable work at hand. Anyone, he says, can do that kind of work. The Chinmaya mission exists for a different kind of conversion altogether, a purely spiritual conversion to the higher truth of Vedanta, the true essence of Hinduism, and indeed the true essence of every true religion the world has ever known. Thus far, I've been offering portraits of these two Advaita mission movements, the silent mission of Ramana Maharshi and the far more public, sort of argumentative vision of the Chinmaya mission. From one point of view, the choice of these two movements may seem counterintuitive. In the late 19th century, for example, the great Advaita teacher Swami Vivekananda, often called the first Hindu missionary to the West, would spell out his agenda in strong, explicit terms. Quote, "The whole of the Western world is on a volcano, which may burst tomorrow. Now is the time to work, so that India's spiritual ideas may penetrate deep into the West. Therefore, young men of Madras, I specially ask you to remember this. We must go out. We must conquer the world through our spirituality and our philosophy." End quote. That's Swami Vivekananda. What we encounter in the silent witness of Ramana Maharshi and the cultural nationalism of Swami Chinmayananda are, on the whole, far more oblique than Vivekananda's clarion call to conquer the world through our spirituality and philosophy. But I would suggest that for precisely this reason, their visions offer special promise for the Christian comparative theologian. That is, they upset some of our assumptions about what a missionary theology can or should look like. And they thus denaturalize or disrupt the theology of mission itself. In the just under 15 minutes I have remaining, I'm going to look at just two areas where I think that Christians might be fruitfully invited to rethink our own theologies and practice of mission. First of all, these Advaita movements draw our attention to the paradoxical dynamics of place and of geography as a missionary message travels to new lands. Thomas Forstoffel has highlighted the perennialist and internalist appeal of Ramana Maharshi's method of self-inquiry, which seems to strip the cultural baggage and even the scriptural foundation from the Advaita teaching to render it truly universal, rooted in the experience of each and every human being. Yet devotees, and Ramana himself, did not hesitate to identify this universal, transcultural, experiential reality with the very particular geography of Arunachala, repeatedly extolled as the spiritual center of the world. There it is there. In one of his 8 stanzas to Arunachala, Ramana writes, quote, "Who is the seer? When I sought within, I watched the disappearance of the seer, and what survived him. No thought of I saw arose. How then could the thought I did not see arise? Who has the power to convey this in word, when even thou couldst do so in ancient days by silence only? Only to convey by silence thy transcendent state, thou standest as a hill, shining from heaven to earth." End quote. Just as Swami Chinmayananda can locate his worldwide Digvijaya in the very particular geography and culture of India, as well as the internal psychological geography symbolized by the BMI chart, so also Ramana Maharshi can reveal the universal reality of each and every conscious being by pointing to a particular sacred hill. And his followers keep finding this hill wherever they go, in a suburb of New York or the coast of Nova Scotia. The picture up there is a picture that I took this past summer. I was on the northern coast of Nova Scotia at the ashram. I visited for about 2 hours, I was there. And I'm walking around with Dennis Hartel, who is the caretaker of that ashram, who built it. And And it was freezing. It was August. It was so cold. And it was foggy and it was raining. And suddenly the fog lifted and there's this crest of this hill behind the farm that they acquired. And Dennis just pointed and said, Arunachala. There it is, in Nova Scotia. The inability of the teaching to be communicated by any human word, symbolized by the mountain Arunachala's immovable silence, becomes the paradoxical basis of its widespread appeal and its continued dissemination. These complex dynamics of place lead us to yet another major theme, the simultaneous assertion and denial of human, or indeed even divine agency in the missionary project. Now, the question of agency is a difficult one in Advaita tradition from its very beginning. By its denial of change and transformation in the true self, in the divine silent witness behind all categorical experience, the tradition ultimately denies the ultimate existence of the ego or of any sense of agency at all. Yet teachers nevertheless teach, and disciples learn, and all of this motivated activity facilitates the dissemination and the perdurance of the teaching. The point, we might say, is to effect a transformation spontaneously, without desire, or without any conscious motive. An analogy that one often encounters in the teaching of Shankara is the active non-action of a magnet, which draws iron filings to itself without seeking in any way to do so. That's what the self does. It draws us that way. In the context of these Advaita mission movements, such a denial of agency in the teaching tradition also reshapes the rhetoric of missionary outreach. And I have to say, I did this yesterday. My background is in rhetoric and composition, so rhetoric's not a bad word for me. Rhetoric is what you try to do. Yeah, so in his work, A Manual of Self-Unfoldment, for example, Swami Chinmaya hails the, quote, great religion of the Hindus, and he calls it a mighty force for universal good. At the same time, he notes that the followers of this great tradition in the past, quote, never thrust their religion forcibly or by trickery on other people. Instead, Hinduism spread in ancient times when, quote, the people of the foreign countries welcomed and hailed the superior culture of the Hindus. Thus, one may say that Hinduism is the mother of civilization in the East. Since Janice, since you're here, I mean, this is what he's saying about Indonesia, right? Like, he's saying that it just spread there because the Indonesians just said, we want this, right? Because of its universality, sorry to single you out, thank you for coming. Because of its universality, its glory, and its self-evident superiority, this religion, which Chinmayananda will later specify as none other than Advaita Vedanta, the universal non-dual teaching of the Hindu Upanishads and epics, as well as of the Christian Bible and all authentic scriptures worldwide, this religion need not be thrust on other people by force or deceit. The primary agency for its transmission lies not with its preachers or teachers, or even with its disciples, but only with its intrinsic, self-luminous attraction. It's like a magnet, which inexorably draws not only other persons, but whole cultures and traditions into its loving embrace. This idea is made still clearer later in the same volume, in a description of the small study groups that would become one of the signature features of the Chinmaya mission. A question is raised. I love this. Study group. Is it a subtle means of conversion to the Christian faith? Tell me like it is, right? So this is at the end. To this, the authors give the following response, quote, not at all. Vedanta is not sectarian in appeal. As experienced by a number of members of study groups all over the world, this study makes one a better individual, irrespective of whatever faith he or she may belong to. Vedanta does not seek converts. It is a great catalyst for a better understanding and self-integration. Its appeal is to the intellect, and its application is universal. Hence, it is used for self-improvement and never for conversion, end quote. The language of self-improvement, and even more, the language of being a catalyst, readily evokes images of gradual, diffuse, and inevitable transformation. Here, the teaching of Vedanta is situated at a higher level relative to participants' individual faith positions, such that it can serve as a catalyst for their ever greater personal integration. Participation in study groups simply, quote, makes one a better individual. Conversion. And what might these two paradoxical themes, the assertion and denial of the significance of place and the assertion and denial of intention and agency, offer to the Christian comparativist? One of the great values of comparative inquiry, as I've suggested, is its power to unsettle and denaturalize previously settled meanings. In this case, I would suggest a study of modern Advaita missionary movements may invite a creative reassessment of Christian conversion. We can explore this by looking at two persons who might be interpreted to model precisely the kind of religious transformation intended by Advaita missionaries like Ramana Maharshi and Swami Chinmaya. First, the enigmatic Benedictine monk Henri Lesseau, also known as Swami Abhishektananda, and second, that missionary par excellence, Paul the Apostle. Since Michael's here, I can tell you, I ran into Michael about a month ago, and I just announced the lecture. He said, "Are you going to talk about Abhishektananda?" And I said, "No." And then I was like, I can. Why not? And it actually works. It actually works very well, I think. So the story of Abhishektananda may be known to many of y'all better than it is to me. Certainly, I think Michael knows it better. A French Benedictine, Henri Lesseau, was summoned to India by his confrère, Jules Mochanet, in 1948 to attempt a kind of experiment in monastic enculturation. I think it's fair to say that Lesseau took this experiment further than anyone expected. Between 1949 and 1955, he made several journeys to Arunachala. He met Ramana Maharshi several times before the sage's death in 1950. After this, he placed himself in the care of a Hindu guru and began to have profound mystical experiences of Advaita. In one of these, he powerfully addressed God as the abyss of the self. Quote, "There is no room in me for God and myself at once. There is but you in the depths of me, you in the depths of all. You who regard me, who summon me, who grant me being by calling me you, by making me your partner, other from you, and yet inseparable, akhanda, advaita, from you, Om, all there is, all that is, has been, will be," end quote. Abhishektananda continued to celebrate the Eucharist as a Catholic priest, I believe throughout his life, and he characterized the relationship between the historic Christ and his experience of Advaita as a kind of holy struggle, without any clear solution, at least without any clear solution in this world of name and form. Toward the end of his life, between 1971 and 1973, he began to articulate a newfound sense of peace and joy in the midst of the struggle. Here, he writes, "In solitude, without and within, the solitude of the only, in the transcendence of all uttering and all thinking, you understand, me, I am, the name under which Yahweh revealed himself. Then Easter becomes this awakening to nothing new, but to what is, to that reality that has neither origin nor end," end quote. Easter here is figured as that dawning experiential knowledge of God and self, deeper than Christianity, deeper than Advaita, deeper than both of them together. Now, others have written at length on Swami Abhishektananda, and his work merits more than the single paragraph I've given him here. But I think that he's a really interesting example if we ask whether he was a convert to Advaita. And if so, what kind of convert was he? Swami Abhishektananda remains Christian throughout his life, but his Christianity is purified and transformed by Advaita. He experiences no change of faith, but his faith does change. He never converts to Vedanta, but his Christianity is profoundly Vedanticized. He may be read to embody what Swami Chinmaya and his disciples mean when they say Vedanta simply makes one a better individual. In this case, a better Christian, a better contemplative, a better monk. And can we read this example in reverse? Is it possible to be changed by Christ without becoming a Christian? It's here that I think recent scholarship on Paul, the apostle, may be instructive. In a 2010 article, I guess 2010, is that still recent? I don't know. Anyway, in a 2010 biblical scholarship, that's ancient, right? In a 2010 article entitled Judaizing the Nations, for example, the New Testament scholar Paula Fredrickson has attempted to challenge many common tropes of Pauline scholarship. In line with the so-called new perspective inaugurated by E.P. Sanders, coincidentally her teacher, Fredrickson argues for the thoroughly Jewish and thoroughly Hellenistic character of Paul's preaching, particularly with regard to the pagans to whom he communicated his gospel. Like most people in the Hellenistic world, she argues, Paul fully identified religious identity with ethnic identity, albeit without excluding considerable permeability in practice and the rare conversion of pagans to Judaism. Like many apocalyptic Jews, however, he also envisioned pagans turning to the Jewish God at the end of time, becoming what she calls ex-pagan pagans, without thereby also becoming Jews. So also for Paul's communities of pagans baptized into the new age, inaugurated by Christ and awaiting its imminent fulfillment. These pagans were Judaized in some key respects, receiving spiritual adoption as children of Abraham, attaining new status as a new temple inhabited by the Spirit of God, and importantly, giving up worship of other gods. But these pagans did not become Jews, and Paul continued to insist strongly on the enduring importance of ethnic Jews, the people Israel, and the Jerusalem temple. In a strict sense of conversion, as a shift from one religious tradition to another then, at least on Fredrickson's reading, Paul never converted, and neither did the pagans reborn in Christ. At least, not in any sense that Paul and other first-century Mediterraneans would have recognized as conversion. Jews remained Jews, pagans remained pagans, yet both received a spirit of new life through their shared participation in the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. Am I doing something wrong? This first generation of Christians consisted, we might say, of both Jews and pagans, distinguished by their religious identity, but united by what we might call their shared Christianization, or better, their Christization. They've been Christed. Read this way, I suggest, the model of Paul and the earliest members of the Jesus movement recommend a renewed exploration of the possibilities of Christian mission in the service of what might be called authentic Christianization or Christization without conversion, of an agentless, spontaneous reception of the Christian message that serves as a catalyst or seasoning for other teachings and traditions. Now, I should alert you to the fact that this is not a new idea. In the Indian context, such prominent theologians as Brahmabandhab Upadhyay, Kajbhago, M.M. Thomas, and Raimundo Panikkar have attempted to imagine radically new configurations between Christ, Christianity, and Hindu traditions, in many cases Advaita Vedanta. So also we have, more recently, heard Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI speak of the gospel of love as a leaven that transforms and elevates religious others, even when it does not lead them to the church. As well as Pope Francis, quoting Pope Benedict, insisting, quote, "It is not by proselytizing that the church grows, but by attraction." Magnet. But the teaching is also not new in a much deeper sense, for the interpretive effort of such theologians and popes represent not only an innovation in the tradition, but I think kind of a return to the questions of an earlier age. More modestly, I would suggest re-encountering folks like Swami Abhishektananda, folks like Paul the Apostle, in and out of an encounter with missionary Advaita provides an additional theological warrant on the Christian side for shifting the controversy about conversion from the categorical to the empirical, and from the general to the particular. Conversion meant one thing for Paul and the first generation of Christians. It meant another thing for Abhishektananda in the middle of the century, and it'll necessarily come to mean different things in each new era. There's ample space, I think, for Christians, Vedantins, and others to discern, separately and together, appropriate means of preaching and teaching, of engaging in dialogue and debate, and of respecting one another's legitimate freedom to convert or not to convert, or indeed to convert in ways that violate common received meanings of conversion and the neat lines between traditions, as Advaita teachers like Ramana Maharshi and Swami Chinmayananda would seem, at least on my reading, to recommend. Thank you very much. Please, Aaron.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really remarkable, and I learned a great deal. Have you ever thought about how this phenomenon of what they call a double belonging might fit into what you're talking about? I was reminded of that as I was...
Yeah, so about 4 paragraphs towards the end of the paper that I read, it's a paper that I presented at a double belonging conference. That's one of the hot items right now, right? So there's lots of work being done on double belonging. I don't like it. So, and for a couple, so stop. Yeah. I'll tell you, there's a couple reasons why I don't like it. One might seem rather odd. I'm sort of a convert, and so that sort of, you know how converts are, right? Annoying. And so I think that I have a kind of resistance. So the whole time I was studying with my guru in India, I was his Christian student, right? And that was very clear in our relationship. Now for him, that just meant I was a student. And so he said, you have some problems, you have the wrong scriptures, you have other virtues that my other students are struggling with, so you're just a student with some virtues and some problems, just like all other students. But for me it was significant, so that's part of it, like I just have kind of a resistance to that. And it might seem funny given everything that I've just described, but I also think that I don't think that Swami Chinmayananda thinks that those who are purified by Vedanta are dual belongers. I think that they're on a journey up. And so I will present it at conferences on dual religious belonging. You know, it's fancy, so I'll say, oh, this is kind of like dual religious belonging, but then the punchline is always, but it's not. You know, for Chinmayananda, there's always sort of, there are different kinds of belonging, but they're lower and higher. And so I think that what I would say more is that what we have are sort of permeable boundaries between traditions. But I would say that a tradition always wins. And so, so I'm kind of conservative in that way. And I think Abhishektananda struggled with that as well. Yeah, so, but good. Yeah. Please, Ernie.
Well, different things, and I apologize for getting your history. You didn't talk about Krishnamurti at all.
No.
Kind of a successor to Vivekananda.
Sort of, yeah.
And he had
Flakier.
Yeah. And he was...
Sorry. Did I say wrong? Yeah. That wasn't me.
Now, among other things, he was very influential with David Bohm, one of the leading...
Yeah, I read David Bohm. I read Krishnamurti. See, Krishnamurti...
That's not really where I want to
Yeah, in my view, he kind of goes off the rails. So, I didn't mention this in the lecture, but all the movements that I look at have some connection to an organization called the Dashanami Federation, which is a monastic federation of sort of more traditional Advaita. Even Ramana Maharshi has an interesting connection to the Dashanami Foundation. And so somebody like Krishnamurti just kind of goes off and does his own thing. And I'm not sort of as interested in those. I'm interested in these movements that have a little more fixity in the Advaita context, if that's fair.
Yeah, I was just curious.
Which doesn't actually
why
mean
this Vivekananda, at the World Parliament,
Oh, yeah.
the first one in Chicago in 1898, really was,
Yeah.
Choir here on that. Correct my on this because my injury is quite a few years old now. But
I was quoting an article from 2010.
minus 40 years. If I remember correctly, though, Buddhism had been making significant inroads in India.
Yeah.
And one of the powers of Shankaracharya was to essentially claim India for Hindu or Vedantic thought
Yeah.
away from Buddhism. And that was part of the reason that it was intrinsically missionary,
Sure.
to if you will,
Yeah.
re-indigenize
Right.
Vedantism. And
That is the narrative of Shankar the Missionary, that book that I...
Yes. And so where I'm going with this is that even though there's of course there's studies that have been done that are old now, comparing Nagarjuna and some others with Shankara. But the question of non-dualism transcending any kind of plurality, any kind of duality, any kind of dialectical dual, it's kind of odd because I'm at a Vedanta dual conversion. It's kind of like you're a non-dual dualist.
Yeah.
Does that mean, here's where I'm really coming out, does that mean that intrinsically in non-dualism there is conversion?
Yeah, I would say yes. So,
Which would mean that it's not simply all-inclusive.
but it's conversion to the universal truth in the teaching of the tradition, right? So I'm not more God than you are, right? The only difference might be my awareness of that. Right? That's the only thing that changes, right? And so, I mean, we talked about this. So one of the fascinating things is the language of return. So in terms of ethno-nationalism, conversion to Hinduism is considered not conversion because it's considered a reconversion. So it's not covered by any of the conversion legislation because indeed Christians and Muslims, as well as people in lower caste or tribals, are considered people who have sort of fallen away from their Hinduism, which is a rite of blood. That's an overtly nationalistic political strategy. I mean, the people who articulated that are taking their cues from 19th and early 20th century Europe, and in particular from the rise of fascism in Italy and in Germany. But interestingly, but Vivekananda can, in an ontological sense, make the same claim about anybody. So we're all Hindus, if Hinduism is non-dualism, if Hinduism is Advaita. And the only question is whether we've owned up to it or not. And so it's always a return.
Then how can you make the claim that it's Hindus?
Because, well, this differs. The five traditions I study all have different answers to this question. Right? So, but generally speaking, the answer has to do with sadhana. What is the efficacious sadhana to arrive at that knowledge? And that's where the dispute is, right? So it's about means. It's about means of arriving at that knowledge. And it's also, I mean, to a certain extent, it's about the content of the knowledge. So people often come to me and say, oh, you study non-dualism. That's sort of like Buddhism. And as well, in the scholastic texts, I mostly have worked with the more ancient texts up to this point. In the scholastic texts that I work with, when the word Buddhist comes up, it usually means the gloves have come off in a debate. Right? You call somebody a Buddhist when you're like, I'm tired. I'm going to put you in the ground in this debate, right? So it's a smear term in the debates, and precisely because they'll characterize Buddhism as a form of nihilism, typically. And so the difference has to do with Brahman and Atman. And they'll say that matters, right? So they'll say, that matters, that if you think that you're searching for shunyata, you're not going to find Brahman, which is what's real. Is it fair? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So it's about sadhana, really, in terms of these boundaries. But that's precisely why somebody like Ramana Maharishi ends up annoying a lot of the more traditional people. Because he'll say, maybe it's about sadhana, or just lie on the ground and stiffen. Like maybe you don't need the shruti. Yeah. Sorry.
Would awakening be a better word than conversion?
Well, so it could be, but I'm really interested, partly because I'm interested in this debate. I'm interested in saying awakening is a kind of conversion. So in the Mundaka Upanishad, at one point, the disciple, once the disciple realizes that there's no liberation through means and ends, that there's no way to achieve liberation through the finite working of empirical reality, and in the Upanishads it's always, no, actually in the Upanishads it's not always a he, but in Shankara it is. He turns around to follow the path of knowledge. The Sanskrit's very clear, right? He was following this path and he turns. And I want to say, yeah, if you want a literal understanding of conversion, that works, right? And I want to call it conversion partly because I think that it destabilizes the debate, which is what I really want to do, right? So can you call it awakening? You could, but then you'd probably be privileging it and setting it in a different category and saying that is not that. And I want to say, no, that and that are pretty intertwined, right? Yeah. And in some cases, historically intertwined, yeah.
So the way that you're trying to push us to reconsider what it is to be a missionary or to be a mission,
Yeah.
what significant religious figure would not be a missionary?
So my answer, okay. Basically none,
Yeah.
right?
So Jesus is a missionary.
Absolutely, yeah.
Jonathan Edwards is a missionary.
For sure, oh yeah. So for me, the interesting question, let me rephrase that. Mission can be made a vague comparative category in such a way that it would comprehend, I would say, any tradition that wants to last more than a generation. I don't know if the Shakers are missionaries. Right? So there might be exceptions, right? So, but if a tradition wants to survive more than a generation, I think that you can talk about it as mission. So for me, the interesting question is, what kind of missionary are they? What form of mission is that? What are its boundaries? What is its, who are potential recipients, right? So for Shankara as a missionary, the real Shankara, not the Shankara of the Vijaya, the recipients is a relatively narrow set of people. It's Brahmin men who've renounced. And not most of those, right? They also have to have perfect detachment, right? And but I want to say that doesn't make it non-missionary. It just makes it a different kind of mission than we see in the 14th century. When the Digvijaya, the narrative of the conquest from Buddhism is Shankara, there's zero evidence that Shankara did that. Right, and in fact, there's a fairly persuasive argument that the narrative of Shankara in which he's doing that is actually based on the narrative of Madhva, who's one of Shankara's rivals. And Madhva, probably the Madhva tradition was stronger at that time, so it's kind of a rearguard action. But I think it's still a really interesting narrative. If you read it theologically, that doesn't matter. Right? What matters is this is their vision of how the tradition will comprehend other traditions. So anyway, yeah. So for me, the interesting question. So I think that when we work in binaries, it ends up fueling the kinds of debates that fuel the conversion controversy. So conversion to Hinduism is not conversion because it's reconversion. Conversion to Christianity is conversion because Christianity is a tradition that's not indigenous to India. And these boundaries are completely arbitrary, right? Zoroastrianism and Judaism are indigenous to India. Christianity is not. And for me, it's much more interesting to say, well, that's one form of conversion, and this is another form of conversion, and how are they related? And how do they interact with each other? So the whole goal of this is to say, let's broaden categories in order to describe things in a more interesting way. Fair? Yeah.
We'll take one last comment or question.
Please.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It's kind of going back a little bit.
Sure.
And I might have misinterpreted what you said, but I believe to Brother Aaron's question, you said that ultimately one has to win, one religion
right.
has to win.
Yeah.
And
I don't mean that in a geopolitical sense.
Interpret that a little bit.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And that's a very dangerous thing to
That
say,
seems
right? Oh yeah,
dangerous.
super dangerous to say, yeah. So that does not leave this room, yeah. I have yet to find that. I have yet to find a figure. for whom Christ or Advaita isn't positioned higher in their personal journey than the other, even if they're both very important. Now, I mean, there are examples, like Abhishektananda seems to have come to some kind of reconciliation. And he actually had a really interesting scheme where one was higher in one respect, and the other was higher in another respect. And I actually respect that too. Like, one's still higher, but you've just got a differentiated vision that's more complex. And the reason for that is simply that I don't think they're coherent with one another. So at one point, when I was studying with my guru in India, it's one of my favorite stories. And so my wife, for example, has heard this. Do you want to tell it? At one point when I was studying with him, I actually got very agitated. This sometimes makes my more progressive friends angry. I got very agitated, and I got on my bicycle. I went everywhere by bicycle at that time. And I ran to my guru's home. He taught out of an apartment. And I come up all flushed, right? So the opposite of the student is described in the Shankara's writings. But that's okay. And I show up and I actually said to Swamiji, I said, Swamiji, on this point, you and I can't both be right. You and I cannot both be right on this point. We could both be wrong. That's possible. Right? We could both be wrong, right? We could be partly right. We could each be partly right. That's an available option. So there were lots of available options. I wasn't sort of saying, I'm done with you or anything like that. I was saying that logically, and this is a tradition that's committed to logic, logically, you and I, this statement and this statement, one of them, they just can't both be right together. And his response, of course, was a proper Advaitin response. He said, of course you're right. I'm glad that you see that. Now can we go on? Yeah. So, and some of that has to do with, and this is where Abhishektananda is interesting, and Ramana Maharishi is interesting. One of the answers to that, to say, is that because you're stuck in a kind of categorical framework. You're stuck in the world of name and form, such that contradictions can arise. And so even my guru would say there are some problems that are never solved, they're only dissolved. You have to set them aside, and then eventually they won't be problems anymore. So I don't want to say that that's a final answer, but it really does seem to me to ring true, that there are incompatibles. Now, why did we keep studying together? Well, we both had a place for each other. Neither of us thought the other was damned, for example. That helps, right? So both of our visions were comic in a certain sense, in the sense that the worst thing that we could imagine happening to each other in that context was that one or both of us was going to be surprised. But both of us believed pleasantly in the long run. Fair? Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Reid.
Thank you.
Thank you.